The American soldier vomited into the elephant grass. September 1967. Firebase Coral, Phuoc Province. The smell had hit him when the Australian patrol returned from a 3-week reconnaissance operation. Not the smell of unwashed men that was standard in Vietnam. This was something else. Something that made his stomach clench and his throat close. The Australians walked past him without acknowledgement, their faces dark with jungle rot, their uniforms stiff with dried mud and worse things. One of them was eating, chewing methodically on something that looked like it had been dead for days. The American could see maggots crawling in the Australian's pack, living maggots. The Australian saw him staring and offered him a piece. The American turned and vomited again. Did you know that the most effective Allied force in Vietnam had a hygiene rejection rate that American commanders called a threat to unit cohesion? 47 formal complaints filed in 8 months. 3. American units refused joint operations citing health concerns. Medical officers at MACV headquarters declared Australian field practices violated basic sanitation standards. You think hygiene doesn't affect combat effectiveness? You're wrong, because what happened next would expose a fundamental divide between armies that thought they were fighting the same war. Why did Australian SAS operators eat rotting food in front of American troops? What made men who could call for resupply choose to live like animals? And why did the disgusting Australians have disease rates 60% lower than Americans despite conditions that should have killed them? Stay until the end, because the answer reveals a truth about survival that contradicts everything modern militaries teach. The cultural collision was inevitable from the moment American and Australian forces began sharing firebase facilities in Phuoc Province. The Americans arrived with expectations shaped by the largest military logistics network in human history. They expected hot meals delivered to forward positions. They expected regular resupply of clean uniforms. They expected field showers, laundry services, mail delivery, and all the infrastructure that transformed Vietnam into something manageable rather than endurable. American troops lived in conditions that would have seemed luxurious to any previous generation of combat soldiers. They ate hot food. They slept in bunks. They changed clothes regularly. This wasn't decadence. This was American military doctrine translated into practice. Keep soldiers healthy and comfortable, because healthy soldiers fight better. The logistics cost was enormous, but America could afford enormous. The system worked in conventional warfare, where supply lines could be established and maintained. Vietnam tested this assumption in ways that made the system's limitations brutally visible. The Australians arrived with different assumptions born from different history. They had fought in New Guinea, where supply lines didn't exist, and men survived on what they carried or what they could take from the enemy or the jungle itself. They had fought in Malaya, where operations lasted months in terrain that swallowed conventional logistics. They had learned that armies dependent on supply were armies that could be defeated by cutting supply, and that independence from logistics was a weapon in itself. Australian soldiers were trained to operate for weeks without resupply, to eat what the jungle provided, to tolerate discomfort that would disable Americans, to function under conditions that modern military medicine said should cause systemic collapse. This wasn't machismo. This wasn't proving anything. This was doctrine developed through decades of operating as a small force in hostile environments, where help wasn't coming and you survived through adaptation or died through dependency. The Australians looked at American firebase infrastructure with something between incomprehension and contempt. All those resources are devoted to comfort. All that logistics capacity consumed by non-combat functions. All that dependency created that made American forces vulnerable. The first serious incident happened in October 1967 when an Australian patrol returned after 18 days in deep jungle. They had been tracking NVA, movement patterns near the Cambodian border, operating in terrain so dense that helicopter resupply was impossible and ground resupply would have compromised their mission. They carried what they needed and made it when it ran out. When they returned, they went through the American mess facility because their own was closed for cleaning. The American cooks watched in growing horror as the Australians ate. They ate enormous quantities, methodically, without apparent pleasure, refueling like machines. But what disturbed the Americans wasn't the quantity. It was what the Australians brought with them. They supplemented mess food with their own rations that had been in the jungle for 18 days. Canned meat that had swollen with bacterial growth. Rice that showed visible mold. Dried fruit covered in a white fungal coating that the Australians scraped off and ate anyway. One Australian unwrapped what looked like a dead lizard, cooked at some point in the past week, and consumed it alongside his powdered eggs. The mess sergeant reported the incident to his commanding officer as a potential health violation. The CO contacted Australian liaison, asking whether their men needed medical evaluation. The Australian response was brief. Their men were fine. They ate what they ate because it was food and they were hungry. The food wasn't spoiled by any standard that mattered. Spoiled meant toxic. Everything else was just food that looked unappealing. The American CO wasn't satisfied. He requested meeting with an Australian medical officer to discuss field sanitation standards. The meeting happened 3 days later and became legendary in both Allied commands for all the wrong reasons. The American medical officer presented concerns about food safety, bacterial contamination, risk of dysentery, and worse diseases. The Australian medical officer listened patiently and then asked a question that ended the conversation. He asked how many Americans had been medically evacuated for gastrointestinal illness in the past month. The answer was 43 from the American Brigade. He stated that the Australian casualty rate for the same conditions was 0. 0 cases requiring evacuation from forces operating under worse conditions with apparently worse hygiene. The American medical officer had no response. The numbers spoke for themselves. The contradiction was absolute and irreconcilable. Americans maintained superior hygiene by any conventional standard. They had clean water. They had regular resupply of fresh rations. They had sanitation facilities. They followed field manuals designed by medical professionals. Yet they had higher disease rates than Australians who ate moldy food and drank untreated water. The American medical establishment couldn't explain this. Their training said bacteria caused disease. Australian conditions should have produced epidemic-level illness. Instead, Australian soldiers were healthier by every measurable standard. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Either American medical doctrine was fundamentally wrong, or something about Australian soldiers made them immune to conditions that disabled Americans. Neither explanation was satisfactory. Neither explanation was fully wrong either. The truth was more complex and more threatening to American assumptions than simple hygiene metrics suggested. Australian soldiers weren't immune to disease. They had adapted to it. The adaptation began in training, where recruits were deliberately exposed to field conditions that would horrify American military physicians. They drank untreated water from streams during exercises. They ate rations that had been stored improperly. They learned to function while experiencing the gastrointestinal distress that came from consuming questionable food and water. Their immune systems adapted. The bacteria that would disable an American caused an Australian mild discomfort at worst. This wasn't genetic. This was acquired immunity built through controlled exposure during training and maintained through continuous low-level exposure in the field. Australian soldiers were always slightly sick by American standards. They just didn't care, because slight sickness was normal and didn't impair function. The alternative, remaining pristine and vulnerable to any contamination, was deadlier. In environments where pristine conditions couldn't be maintained, the symbolic object that crystallized this divide was something mundane: a canteen. American soldiers carried canteens filled with purified water from approved sources. They refilled at designated water points, where engineer units maintained purification equipment. They were trained never to drink from streams, never to consume water that hadn't been treated, never to risk contamination. Australian soldiers carried canteens too, but they refilled from whatever source was available: streams, rice paddies, shell craters filled with rainwater. They used purification tablets when they remembered. Often they didn't bother. The water tasted like mud and probably contained things that would make Americans violently ill. Australians drank it without concern because their systems could handle what the water contained. This drove American medics insane. They watched Australians committing what looked like slow suicide through water consumption, and they couldn't understand why the Australians weren't dying. The canteen became a symbol of incompatible philosophies. Americans saw hydration as a medical concern requiring clean water. Australians saw hydration as a tactical concern requiring any water. Both perspectives worked within their respective systems. Neither side could understand how the other system functioned. The disgust American soldiers felt toward Australian practices intensified as contact increased. Joint operations forced Americans to witness Australian field life at close range, and what they saw violated every standard they had been taught. Australians didn't change clothes for weeks at a time. They wore the same uniform until it rotted off their bodies, then requisitioned replacement. They didn't bathe. They didn't shave. They didn't maintain the personal hygiene that Americans considered basic human decency. Their equipment was covered in mold. Their packs smelled like death. Their sleeping areas attracted insects that American physicians kept controlled through systematic insecticide application. Australian soldiers seemed to exist in a state of decay, as if the jungle was slowly consuming them and they were accepting it rather than fighting it. To Americans raised in a culture that equated cleanliness with civilization, the Australian condition looked like surrender to barbarism. The fact that Australians seemed unbothered, even amused by American disgust, made it worse. The breaking point came in November 1967 during Operation Paddington. A joint reconnaissance mission in War Zone D2 SEAL team members were embedded with an Australian SAS patrol for 2 weeks. The mission was to gather intelligence on NVA supply routes. The SEALs were experienced jungle operators, not squeamish new arrivals. They had conducted dozens of missions in similar terrain. They considered themselves elite, capable of matching any allied force. The first week challenged that assumption. The Australians operated differently than any force the SEALs had encountered. They moved impossibly slowly, stopping every few minutes to observe, spending hours in positions the SEALs considered tactically insignificant. They ate once per day, a cold meal consumed in 5 minutes without ceremony. They drank water that looked contaminated. They didn't change clothes or clean equipment. By day 5, one SEAL developed severe diarrhea that required extraction. The other stayed but struggled. The Australians showed no sympathy. This was normal. This was the mission. Adapt or fail. On day 9, the patrol ran out of conventional rations. The Australians transitioned to living off the jungle without discussion or apparent concern. They caught lizards and cooked them over small fires that produced almost no smoke. They harvested palm hearts that required destroying young trees. They dug up roots that looked poisonous and ate them after brief cooking. The remaining SEAL watched in horrified fascination. This wasn't survival training. This wasn't an emergency procedure. This was standard Australian practice. When rations ran out, You ate what the environment provided. The Australian Patrol. Leader offered the SEAL a portion of cooked snake. The SEAL declined. He ate his last energy bar and tried not to think about how many days remained before extraction. The Australians ate everything they killed, wasting nothing, showing no preference or disgust. Meat was meat. Protein was protein. The source didn't matter. The SEAL realized these men weren't operating in the jungle. They were operating as part of the jungle, accepting its terms completely. The mission produced valuable intelligence. It also produced the most damning after-action report ever filed about Allied forces. The SEAL's report described Australian field practices as subhuman, stated that their hygiene posed health risk to American personnel, and recommended that future joint operations include protocols for maintaining basic human standards. The report circulated through MACV headquarters and caused immediate controversy. The Australian command demanded an apology. The American command defended their men. The dispute escalated until a joint investigation was ordered to determine whether Australian practices actually posed health risk to Allied operations. The investigation lasted 3 months and produced findings that satisfied no one. Australian practices did violate American field hygiene standards. They also produced no measurable increase in disease transmission to American forces. The practices were disgusting by American cultural standards, but not dangerous by medical standards. The investigation recommended that American personnel receive cultural training about Allied differences, but stopped short of requiring Americans to tolerate conditions they found intolerable. The cultural training never happened. Instead, an informal segregation developed. American and Australian forces continued to cooperate on operations, but maintained separate living facilities, separate mess facilities, separate medical support. Segregation was never an official policy. It emerged organically as Americans sought. To avoid daily exposure to Australian practices they found revolting. The Australians were indifferent. They had never sought American approval. They operated according to doctrine that worked for them, and American disgust was an American problem. This mutual separation reduced friction, but also reduced learning opportunities. Americans could have learned why Australian practices worked. Australians could have understood why Americans found those practices disturbing. Neither side was interested. They simply avoided each other when possible and maintained professional distance when avoidance was impossible. The war continued with allies who collaborated, but didn't integrate. The irony was that American disgust masked genuine Australian advantages. The practices Americans found revolting were actually sophisticated adaptations to jungle warfare. Australian willingness to eat marginal food meant they could operate longer without resupply. Their tolerance for contaminated water meant they could use hydration sources Americans had to avoid. Their comfort with physical decay meant they could remain in the field for durations that would break American morale. These weren't signs of barbarism. They were force multipliers. Australian SAS could conduct reconnaissance patrols lasting 30 days with initial supply load that would support Americans for 10 days. That capability gap was decisive in environments where logistics determined what operations were possible. The Australians could go places and do things that were logistically impossible for Americans. The Americans saw this capability and attributed it to Australian willingness to suffer unnecessarily. They missed the point. The Australians weren't suffering. They had redefined what constituted acceptable field conditions, and that redefinition expanded their operational capability beyond what American doctrine allowed. The clearest example came in February 1968 during the Tet Offensive. Australian SAS teams were operating deep in territory when the offensive began. They were weeks from resupply, living off the jungle, gathering intelligence that would prove crucial to understanding NVA intentions. American forces attempted similar deep reconnaissance, but had to extract teams after 10 days because resupply was impossible and men couldn't function longer without it. The Australians stayed. They continued operating through the entire offensive, providing intelligence that couldn't have been gathered any other way. Their reports identified NVA assembly areas, supply caches, and command facilities that became targets for American firepower. The intelligence was invaluable. It was only possible because Australian soldiers could function under conditions Americans couldn't tolerate. The American command appreciated the intelligence. They remained disgusted by the men who gathered it. The contradiction never resolved. Private First Class David Chun represented the American perspective perfectly. Chun was third-generation American, raised in California. Accustomed to standards of cleanliness his immigrant grandparents would have considered luxurious. He encountered Australian SAS at Firebase Coral in March 1968 and later wrote extensively about the experience. His letters home described the Australians in terms usually reserved for describing enemy forces. He called them filthy, inhuman animals who had forgotten what civilization meant. He described watching an Australian eat rice that was moving with insect larvae and feeling his stomach heave. He described the smell of Australian quarters as worse than latrine smell, because the latrine smell was at least honest. The Australian smell was decay, rot, death that somehow kept walking around. Chun's disgust was genuine and visceral. It was also profoundly cultural. He was measuring Australian behavior against American middle-class standards that had no relevance in a combat environment. The Australians were measuring their behavior against whether it kept them alive. Different standards, different worlds. Transformation in American attitudes began slowly and came not from understanding, but from necessity. By mid-1968, American forces were stretched thin. The operational tempo demanded longer patrols, deeper penetrations, more time away from firebase. Support. American soldiers found themselves in situations where resupply wasn't possible and field conditions deteriorated toward Australian standards. They discovered what Australians already knew. You could function while filthy. You could eat questionable food if you were hungry enough. You could drink contaminated water if the alternative was dehydration. You could tolerate discomfort that seemed intolerable until you had no choice. American soldiers who spent 3 weeks in the deep jungle came back looking and smelling like Australians. They developed the same 1,000-yard stare, the same indifference to conditions, the same mechanical approach to consumption, where food was fuel and nothing more. They didn't become Australians, but they stopped judging Australian practices quite so harshly because they had learned those practices emerged from conditions rather than from choice. The medical data told a story that contradicted American assumptions completely. Throughout 1968 and 1969, Australian forces maintained lower disease rates than American forces, despite worse field conditions by every conventional metric. The Australian advantage wasn't genetic or cultural in some mystical sense. It was immunological. Australian soldiers maintained constant low-level exposure to pathogens that kept their immune systems active. American soldiers maintained pristine conditions until they deployed, then got hit with a full pathogen load their systems couldn't handle. The Australian approach was a continuous mild challenge. The American approach was sterility followed by overwhelming exposure. From a public health perspective, the Australian approach was madness. From a combat effectiveness perspective, it worked. The American medical establishment studied the data without changing doctrine, because changing doctrine would require admitting that cleanliness wasn't always optimal, and that admission threatened foundational assumptions about military medicine. Staff Sergeant Robert McKinnon became an unlikely bridge between these incompatible worlds. McKinnon was Special Forces, multiple tours, experienced enough to recognize that effectiveness mattered more than comfort. He spent 6 weeks embedded with Australian SAS, learning their reconnaissance techniques. The first week was hell. He couldn't eat their food. He couldn't drink their water. He couldn't tolerate their living conditions. He lost 12 pounds and considered requesting extraction. The second week was worse, because his body was adjusting, and the adjustment was painful. The third week something shifted. He ate what they ate without his stomach rebelling. He drank what they drank without immediate consequences. He slept in conditions that would have kept him awake weeks earlier. By week 6, he was functioning. At their level, operating in ways he couldn't have imagined before. When he returned to American forces, he brought Australian practices with him. His team started training with contaminated water. They started extending patrols beyond resupply capacity. They started learning to live like Australians when necessary. McKinnon's commander was skeptical, but couldn't argue with the results. McKinnon's team conducted longer patrols with better intelligence returns than any comparable American unit. The cost was that they came back looking and smelling disgusting. The benefit was they came back alive with information that saved other lives. The symbolic weight of the canteen grew heavier as the war progressed. American units operating beyond fire-based support began adopting Australian water practices out of necessity. They learned to identify relatively clean water sources. They learned to use purification tablets properly rather than treating them as magic talismans. They learned that drinking contaminated water was better than dehydration, that their bodies would adapt, that the consequences were manageable. This learning never became official doctrine. Field manuals still mandated approved water sources. But field practice diverged from field manuals because reality demanded it. Soldiers who adopted Australian water discipline could operate longer and farther. Soldiers who maintained American standards found themselves constrained by logistics. The choice was clear, even if no one wanted to acknowledge it officially. The canteen that had represented incompatible philosophies became a symbol of American adaptation. The fact that Americans remained disgusted while adapting showed how profound the cultural difference was. They did what worked while hating that. It worked that the Australian perspective on American disgust was complicated. Some Australians were amused. They had been called worse things by better people, and American squeamishness seemed childish. Other Australians were offended. They were professional soldiers operating according to doctrine that produced results, and American judgment felt like moral condemnation of methods that kept them alive. Most Australians simply didn't care. They had jobs to do in American. Opinions didn't affect whether those jobs got done. The cultural gap was too wide to bridge through understanding, so they didn't try. They operated in their way. Americans operated in their way. When circumstances forced collaboration, both sides made it work professionally, if not comfortably. The mutual respect that eventually developed wasn't based on understanding or approval. It was based on recognition that both sides were effective using incompatible methods. That was enough. Corporal James Mitchell represented the Australian perspective as clearly as Chun represented the American view. Mitchell was SAS, second tour, raised in rural Queensland, where comfort was luxury and work was hard. He encountered American disgust with bewilderment that eventually curdled into contempt. He wrote in his diary about Americans who expected war to be clean, who thought you could fight without getting dirty, who believed logistics could solve problems that actually required endurance. He described watching Americans refuse to drink available water and wait for resupply helicopters instead, wasting hours and creating vulnerability because they couldn't tolerate what the water might contain. He described American shower facilities. At fire bases, the resources devoted to keeping men clean, the priority given to comfort over capability. Mitchell's contempt was absolute. These were warriors who had mistaken warfare for camping trips. They wanted to fight on their terms, in their conditions, with their support structure. The jungle didn't care what they wanted. The enemy didn't accommodate their logistics. Mitchell believed Americans were brave, but fundamentally soft, unable to function without infrastructure that made them dependent and vulnerable. His belief was confirmed every time he saw American forces constrained by supply requirements that didn't limit. Australian operations, the breaking point in mutual perception, came during Operation Goodwood in August 1968, combined Australian and American forces conducted a sweep through the suspected NVA base area. The operation lasted 19 days. Resupply helicopters were available for the first 11 days. Then weather closed in and no flights were possible for 8 days. The Americans began rationing food immediately. By day 14, they were on quarter rations and morale was deteriorating. The Australians transitioned to jungle foraging on day 12 without apparent concern. They shared nothing with Americans, not out of cruelty, but because their supply situation didn't include feeding Allied forces. The Americans watched Australians eat and felt resentment that overwhelmed their disgust. The Australians had food. It was terrible food, but it was food. The Americans had nothing. Some Americans approached Australian positions and asked for food. The Australians refused. They explained that they had exactly enough for their own needs. That sharing would compromise their operational capability, that Americans should have prepared better. The Americans felt betrayed. The Australians felt vindicated. This was exactly what they had warned about. Dependency on logistics created vulnerability. Now Americans were experiencing that vulnerability directly. On day 16, several Americans attempted to forage for themselves. They had no training in jungle food sources. They harvested plants that looked edible and prepared them according to guesswork. 3 men developed severe gastric distress from consuming toxic plants. 1 required emergency extraction when weather briefly cleared. The Australians watched this unfold with something between pity and contempt. Americans were starving in a jungle that contained abundant food because they had never learned what was safe to eat. The skill gap was profound. Australian soldiers identified dozens of edible plants instinctively. American soldiers couldn't identify any. The Australians had been taught jungle survival as a core skill. The Americans had been taught that logistics would always provide. Both sides were right within their doctrinal frameworks. But in this moment, in this place, the Australian framework worked and the American framework failed. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. The operation ended on day 19 when weather cleared and resupply became possible. The Americans evacuated hungry and demoralized. The Australians walked out in similar physical condition to when they had entered. The after-action reports from both sides revealed absolute disconnect. The American report blamed inadequate logistics planning and recommended better coordination between operations and supply. The Australian report noted that American forces lacked basic field skills and couldn't function without continuous logistical support. Both reports were factually accurate. Both missed the deeper truth. American-Australian armies were optimized for different types of warfare. Americans excelled at conventional operations where logistics could be maintained. Australians excelled at unconventional operations where logistics couldn't be maintained. Vietnam was primarily an unconventional war, which gave Australians structural advantage. But acknowledging this advantage would require Americans to admit their doctrine was mismatched to the conflict. That admission never came officially. The transformation in American attitudes accelerated through 1969 as more soldiers experienced what Operation Goodwood had demonstrated. You could maintain pristine conditions and remain dependent, or you could embrace field conditions that looked disgusting and gain independence. The trade-off was stark. American small unit leaders increasingly chose independence. They trained their men to forage, to drink marginal water, to tolerate discomfort that garrison standards would prohibit. This training happened informally, shared through personal networks rather than official channels. The men who learned it operated more effectively. The men who refused remained limited by logistics. The natural selection was gradual but inexorable. Units that adapted to Australian standards expanded their operational capability. Units that maintained American standards contracted theirs. By 1970, the most effective American small units in Vietnam operated using methods that would have disgusted their predecessors in 1967. They didn't call them Australian methods. They called them field expedient tactics. But the source was obvious to anyone who looked. The medical establishment eventually produced an explanation for Australian disease resistance that satisfied American scientific requirements. Australian soldiers maintained diverse gut flora developed through continuous exposure to varied pathogens. Their immune systems were constantly active rather than dormant. When exposed to new pathogens, their systems responded faster and more effectively than American systems that had been kept pristine. The Australian advantage was immunological diversity maintained through exactly the practices Americans found disgusting. The explanation was published in military medical journals in 1970 and largely ignored because it suggested that optimal health practices for garrison were suboptimal for combat. The cognitive dissonance was too great. American military medicine continued teaching that cleanliness prevented disease, while data from Vietnam suggested that selective exposure to dirt built resistance more effectively than pristine conditions. The contradiction never resolved doctrinally. Lieutenant Michael Patterson experienced the transformation personally and wrote about it with unusual honesty. Patterson deployed in 1968, believing Australian practices were barbaric. He returned in 1970, having adopted many of those practices himself. His evolution was documented in letters home that showed progressive acceptance of what he initially rejected. Early letters described Australian disgust in terms similar to Chun's descriptions. Later letters described necessity forcing adaptation. Final letters described the realization that Australian methods weren't barbaric. They were pragmatic responses to environmental demands. Patterson's transformation wasn't unique. Thousands of American soldiers went through similar evolution, learning that effectiveness required abandoning standards they had considered non-negotiable. The soldiers who completed this evolution operated better. They also couldn't fully reintegrate into garrison military culture that still valued appearance and cleanliness over field effectiveness. They became cultural hybrids, operating according to different rules in different contexts. Never entirely comfortable in either. The symbolic culmination came in December 1970 when American Special Forces hosted Australian SAS for joint training exercise at a fire base in Binh Duong province. The exercise included extended patrol without resupply, explicitly designed to force Americans to adopt Australian field living practices. The Americans expected difficulty. What they experienced was revelation. When clean water ran out, they drank from streams using Australian techniques. When rations depleted, they foraged using Australian knowledge. When hygiene degraded, they discovered they could function anyway. By the end of the exercise, the Americans looked and smelled like Australians. More importantly, they understood why Australians operated as they did. The disgust hadn't disappeared entirely, but it was now accompanied by respect and recognition. That Australian practices emerged from sophisticated understanding of jungle warfare rather than from cultural deficiency. The Australians who supervised the training were satisfied. The Americans had learned. That was what mattered, the lasting impact of Australian influence on American special operations was profound, but never officially acknowledged. Modern American Special forces train extensively in survival skills, in operating without logistic support, in tolerating field conditions that garrison forces would consider unacceptable. These capabilities are presented as American innovations. Actually, they are Australian lessons learned in Vietnam and absorbed into American doctrine without attribution. The institutional pride that initially produced disgust toward Australian practices prevented honest acknowledgement that Australians had understood things Americans needed to learn. So the learning happened quietly, transmitted through personal relationships and field experience rather than through official channels. The canteen that symbolized incompatible philosophies eventually came to symbolize merged capability. Modern American operators carry canteens and drink from whatever water source is available, using techniques developed by Australians decades earlier. They don't know the source. They just know the methods worked. The epilogue to this story is written in survival rates and operational capabilities that exceeded what either ally achieved independently. Australian field practices that Americans found disgusting in 1967 became standard for American special operations by 1975. The transformation wasn't complete. American forces never fully adopted Australian comfort with decay and contamination, but they moved far enough in that direction to gain the operational independence that Australian practices provided. The cost was abandoning cultural standards about cleanliness and civilization that Americans had considered foundational. The benefit was capability to operate in environments where those standards couldn't be maintained. The trade was worth it in lives saved and missions accomplished. Whether it was worth it in cultural terms remains debated. Some veterans believe they lost something essential by embracing practices they initially recognized as degrading. Others believe they gained essential capability by abandoning arbitrary standards that served garrison life but compromised field effectiveness. The canteen sits now in the Australian War Memorial, alongside the teacup and other artifacts from Vietnam service. This particular canteen was carried by an SAS operator through 4 years of combat operations. It shows dents from impacts, stains from contents, wear from constant use. The placard notes it was used to drink from streams, rice paddies, and other unimproved water sources throughout Vietnam. The placard doesn't mention American disgust or eventual American adoption of the practices the canteen represents. The memorial visitors walk past without understanding significance. Just an old canteen, unremarkable. But for men who understand the story, the canteen represents a moment when two allied armies discovered that effectiveness and civilization could conflict, that survival might require abandoning standards they had considered non-negotiable, that disgust and respect could coexist when confronting methods that worked through means they couldn't approve. The final truth is about adaptability versus standards. Military organizations require standards to function at scale. Standards create consistency, enable coordination, maintain discipline across millions of personnel. But standards can also create rigidity, prevent adaptation to local conditions, and prioritize appearance over effectiveness. The Australian military operated with fewer personnel and less rigid standards, which gave them flexibility to adapt methods to the environment, rather than forcing the environment to accommodate methods. The American military operated with enormous personnel and rigid standards, which gave them consistency but reduced flexibility. Neither approach was universally superior. They were optimized for different challenges. The tragedy was that American institutional culture made learning from Australian flexibility nearly impossible. The disgust American soldiers felt toward Australian practices was genuine. It was also an obstacle to learning lessons that would save American lives. The soldiers who overcame their disgust and learned Australian methods operated more effectively. The institution that maintained its standards and rejected Australian influence remained constrained by logistics and comfort requirements that limited operational capability. The lesson applies beyond Vietnam, beyond military context, to any situation where effectiveness requires abandoning standards that seem foundational. Organizations optimize for specific conditions. When conditions change, optimization can become a liability. The question is whether the organization can recognize that its standards have become constraints and adapt accordingly, or whether it will maintain standards that no longer serve their purpose because changing them would require admitting that past approaches were wrong. The American military in Vietnam eventually adapted to Australian lessons, but never admitted the adaptation officially. The soldiers learned. The doctrine didn't change. That gap between field practice and official doctrine persisted through the war's end and beyond. Modern American special operations have finally closed that gap, incorporating into doctrine the lessons that soldiers learned informally decades earlier. But the closure came through generational turnover rather than institutional acknowledgement. The men who felt disgust toward Australian practices retired or died. The men who learned from those practices rose to positions where they could reshape doctrine. The transformation took 50 years and is still incomplete. The canteen represents that transformation, slow, painful, never fully acknowledged, but ultimately successful in expanding American capability through lessons learned from allies who operated under constraints that forced innovation. The disgust was real. The learning was real. Both truths coexist in that battered metal container that held water from sources American. Military medicine said would kill you, but that actually sustained men through years of combat operations. The canteen asks a question that every military organization must answer. Do you optimize for your standards or for your mission? The Australian answer was clear. Mission effectiveness determined methods. Standards that compromised effectiveness were abandoned. The American answer was more complex. We want both. We want effectiveness within our standards. When that's possible, the American approach produces better results through consistency and scale. When it's not possible, the American approach produces constraints that limit capability. Vietnam was an environment where it often wasn't possible. The Australians accepted that reality immediately. The Americans learned it slowly, through failures and casualties, through watching allies operate effectively, using methods they found revolting. The learning happened. The disgust never fully disappeared. That combination, learning from what you find disgusting, adopting methods you can't approve of, succeeding through means that violate your standards, is the hardest lesson any organization learns. Most never learn it. Some learn it too late. The Americans in Vietnam learned it slowly, but ultimately well enough to survive and transform their doctrine for future conflicts. The canteen is a monument to that difficult learning, symbol of capability, purchased through abandoning certainty. Through accepting that effectiveness sometimes requires doing what seems wrong until you understand why it's right.